Stephen Kotler, welcome to the Development by David podcast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm such a huge fan of your work because it blends both science and stories. You are the primary thinker, in my eyes, of flow and chasing the impossible. I want to bring together your story and science. So, can I ask you, where did the origin story of your work in flow and your science begin?
God, there's so many origin stories. Like there are just so many. Uh, Take your pick. Give me a little more steer. The story I usually tell is I when I got out of uh, college and grad school, really like I was an old punk rocker, so I had long dreads, and there weren't a lot of jobs at the time, especially for like guys who looked like that, back in the day. Um, but punks had sort of wedged their way into magazine journalism. There's a long story there, but we had sort of like we had a toehold in magazine journalism, so you could get work. And I became a journalist really because they wouldn't have me in any other industries. And I was always a science geek, and I was really interested in neuroscience predominantly. I was interested in how humans work. Psychology felt really squishy to me. Like I could read it, but like this person had a model, and this person had a model, and this person had a model, and they weren't based on mechanism, and they couldn't tell me which one really worked better. And it just felt like people were making it up. They figured out what works for themselves, and they were training it, calling it something else, and it just didn't work for me. Neuroscience was interesting because it was mechanism. And it's just so like what works for me will work for you. If you're going from neuroscience, it's shared among all humans. So I thought, okay, if you want to know how humans work and you're interested in performance, this is a tool. And neuroscience was this really incredibly boring field until the early 1990s. Up to that moment, it was like, what is this cluster of cells in the brain called, and what does it maybe do? And then all of a sudden, in the 90s, what are emotions? What's consciousness? What's an altered state of consciousness? Psychedelics became like a serious topic, and like all this stuff that I was super curious about, which had really sort of been outlawed, and you couldn't talk about it in science. The very first time there was like a cutting edge group of scientists who were willing to have these conversations. And so I was really psyched on that. And I was also I was an action sport athlete. And if you know anything about action, and I was living in what is now Palisades, Tahoe. It used to be Squaw Valley, which was the sort of the mecca of extreme skiing and snowboarding back in the 90s. And if you know anything about the 1990s and action sports, it's often talked about as the era of impossible, right? More stuff that we thought was never going to be done because you just couldn't do it and live. It just kept getting done over and over and over again, right? So this had my attention, and like, why was this happening? But what really had my attention, and you're going to appreciate this with your background, is anything about peak performance in the 90s, like here's the secret. You better like have the right parents. You better go to the right schools and have the right coaches. You better have money because it's expensive and blah blah. And that was essentially what was peak performance in the 1990s. There were a couple other things you had to have, like you had to be able to resist temptation and things like that. But like the community I was in, no, first of all, nobody could resist temptation. Like these were action sport athletes, right? They wanted the sensation of immediate gratification all the time. But everybody I knew, like they weren't wealthy. They didn't have a lot of education. They came from broken homes. They had shitty childhoods, really horrible childhoods. A lot of them, they had no money, very little education. And you know what happens in communities like that? There's a lot of risk taking and there's a lot of substance abuse. And the general rule is what happens: people die young or they go to jail. That's what happens. What they don't do is reinvent what's possible for the human species. And that's what was going on in action sports. And I was like, how, where, how, what the hell? And I thought, God, I can use neurobiology, neuroscience to decode this. And I had, just to wrap it full circle, because you started with the storytelling and the science, there was a trend in the late 80s where there were a handful of writers who were mostly trained as fiction writers, such as myself. I'm actually trained as a poet, and then I became a fiction writer, but it would switch to nonfiction and switch to journalism. And they were trying to bring in storytelling techniques like fiction style storytelling techniques into journalism. The first movement was new journalism. I was part of the second movement, which is new journalism. Really fabulous titles there. But and nobody was in neuroscience. Like my buddy David Quammen was awesome, and he was doing biology. And John McPhee is sort of the godfather of this stuff, and he was in geology. And there were a couple other people who were doing it. And I was like, God, could you use these same techniques in neuroscience? Could it even be possible? And that was sort of my mission as a writer. I was really fascinated. I like hard writing challenges. So that was fascinating to me. Could I actually find a way to like learn enough neuroscience? You know what I mean? And the full cap is like what all the athletes had in common was that all figured out how to harness the state of flow and use it to their advantage, like almost no other group of people in history. It's not just the athletes, right? Whenever you see a culture of innovation, whenever we see peak human performance, we're seeing flow. But I was seeing it in the athletes, and they were talking about it in very peculiar terms that like most scientists would have dismissed, except for the fact that people were starting to research so-called spiritual experiences. So when dudes are saying like, I'm going surfing and I'm becoming one with the wave, or I'm going skiing and I'm becoming one with the mountain, and then I perform at my best, rather than saying, well, you're just crazy. That doesn't make any sense. That's not real. My mentors and the people who were training me in neuroscience were like, no, 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 that's a very common experience. People have that experience. We need to take it seriously. We need to say, okay, if that's real, what could possibly be causing it, and how could it help us be performing better? Right. So those were suddenly became real questions. So this thing that was super flaky was, suddenly, semi real. Okay. So that was the long, short origin story from a couple of directions.
Given your fascination in extreme sports and your fascination in neuroscience, these two communities seem like worlds apart. Like growing up in a skateboarding community, everyone's quite ephemeral. They don't really have explanations to why the tricks are cool. They're not very scientific in nature. They're quite creative, hippie, and perhaps rebellious to science to some degree. They don't really incorporate into their their stunts and the way they think about the tricks that they do. They're quite hippie.
So
How
that's
did
a
you?
yes and no. Well, that's a yes and no. Also, you gotta. That is a general opinion, and you can find a lot of that. But Rodney Mullins, who essentially invented everything in skateboarding and is a friend, is now at MIT, right? Studying embodied
Mm,
cognition, right?
really?
And Rodney, like, get into a math discussion with Rodney or a science discussion with Rodney. I mean, he blows me out of the water. Andrew Huberman, who's probably got the top neuroscience podcast in the world, came up as a skater in the San Francisco skate community. You go into consciousness studies, and when I was sort of coming in, Christoph Koch was one of the big names, and Christoph had like an orange mohawk and was a rock climber. And Boy Wonder, Hugh Hare, who's the head of biomechatronics at MIT, an inventor of bionics. Um, Started out as Boy Wonder. He was the youngest like rock climbing mountaineer in America to like win everything. Then he lost his legs in a rock climbing or a mountaineering accident and became like the best paraplegic rock climber. And then what? Fuck, this technology sucks. Let's build some better technology. And that's where bionic legs came from. And so there's actually a deep culture of science tucked inside of action sports. And even going back to like, let's go back to like, my era, Shane McConkey was one of the giants in free skiing and in the history of action sports. Yeah, if you sit down with Shane and want to talk genetics, he's probably going to be lost. But he knows enough about design that he reshapes skis, and that's about hydrodynamics, right? He was thinking about how to planing surfaces move across liquids or frozen liquids, and he totally like reinvented skiing. We got fat skis, we got twin tips, all that stuff literally came out of people who may not like science, but like have amazing engineering brains on top of it. And even if you take it one step further, I always say that like my job is a translator. I look at what's going on at the extreme, whether it's the extreme of neuroscience or the extreme of action sports or spec ops or these communities, even like just crazy communities of innovation, hip hop and like things like that, where you're seeing so much innovation. And I go in there and I say, okay, why is this happening? What's happening? What are you doing? The answer is always flow and some other stuff. And you know what I mean? And that's sort of the work. And I figure out what those people are doing. And I'm like, all right, I'm not those people, right? And how do I get this stuff to work for me? And once I sort of figure out what works for me, that doesn't prove anything. I'm then like, okay, how do I get it to work for maybe a small group of friends? And if it works there, I say, okay, how do we take it into our lab and really hammer on and test it and write neuroscience papers about it and publish them? And then we try to train other people with it. And that's sort of my process with that stuff.
Stephen, do you remember a time or an incident or an example where you fell in love with your first impossible, a feat that you might have seen on TV or in person that really made you want to devote your life to studying this?
So what I remember most, it's not an, it wasn't, it was an impossible sort of. I'm not a naturally gifted athlete, and but I really and when I came into action sports, those were not sports, right? We were just punk rockers. This is what like this is the shit punk rockers did. We were this wasn't sports. That was stuff for jocks. The jocks were the one who wanted to beat us up all the time, right? They played football. We were at skateboards. Come on, totally different world, right? Now I'm watching skating in the Olympics, and it's so like jaw dropping to me. But the I was 13 years old. It was the first. I had a crush on a girl named Vicky, and I was at the ski area, Seven Springs up in Pennsylvania. I was with my best friend, Jimmy Desmond at the time, and I heard a rumor that Vicky was at Seven Springs, and I was like skiing down, and I thought I saw her on the chairlift. And if you know anything about flow, right? If you're wired a certain way for certain people in certain situations, showing off, especially for somebody you're attracted to, it's a pretty good. Like it's got a lot of risk. It's got a lot of like it focuses the attention. It can drive performance pretty well. I will tell you that inside the action sports community people you've admired for decades, if you actually get into their origin stories, a remarkable number of them will say, "Yeah, I started. I wanted to impress a boy, or I wanted to impress a girl." Like that's like you go back to the, like what happened, and that's always the story. It's really funny. So yeah, I thought, and I threw my first back scratcher and ever, which is a trick in skiing where you hit a jump and you kick your skis in your back. And I was like 13, and I was a klutz. Like I had tried that trick earlier in the day, and I'd literally like pancaked on my face and nearly broken my nose, and like sort of like gone down crying, like really hurt myself. And but like Vicky was on the lift, and I nailed it, and it was a deep flow state, and I didn't know what it was. I just remember like sort of landing and skiing away. And I remember we turned into the trees and time had slowed down, right? So it was creeping. And like I was moving through these tight trees and everything was just like freeze frame, like bullet time, which, in the early days of flow research, also, we don't talk much about it now because it got solved. And you know what I mean? It's solved. In fact, I'm working on a really complicated paper on the neurodynamics of time perception. And we know like there are 11 different timekeeping structures in the brain. We understand how they all work now. When they get warped, when time speeds up or slows down, we know all about why that happens. We know why it happens in flow. We know how it helps performance. But at the time, dude, I went skiing. I went off this jump and time slowed down. Was the kind of thing that got you sent to rehab. Like in my day, that's got you sent to rehab. Like you say those kinds of things, they're like, uh-huh. First, you go to the school psychiatrist, and when they can't solve it, well, you're doing too many drugs, so we're going to send you to rehab. And like you're laughing about it, but like that was literally like that was the world I grew up in. I'm not like literally that's not uncommon. I like that was most of my friends had been sent to rehab. I had been sent to the principal's office on numerous occasions because like I would write a poem for the school paper and people would be like, "Oh, dude, it's too dark. It's too punk rock. Something's really wrong with him. We got to get him help. He's clearly suicidal." And I find myself like I wrote a poem and suddenly I did like three strings in a room and you're like, "What the fuck? How did I end up here?" It was a weird time.
What is the origin story of the flow state? Why does it exist? How did it serve our
So
ancestors?
yeah, let's do that. Let's start with definitions. What is flow? Flow is technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. That's a scientific definition. Doesn't help anybody, but that's the scientific definition. What it means is any of those moments of total absorption and rapt attention. You get so focused on whatever you're doing, the task at hand, that you just get absorbed into it. Action awareness will start to merge, your sense of self, self consciousness, your inner critic, the voice in your head, that nagging defeatist on, always on voice, gets quiet. Time passes strangely. The most common experience is not what happened to me where we started with skiing. It doesn't slow down. That happens, but that's rare. Much more frequently is you just get so sucked into what you're doing that a couple hours go by and you didn't even notice. This happens all the time. You're talking to your best friend, right? Suddenly 2 hours have gone by and what the, right? Like that's, and so, and throughout all aspects of performance, that's mental, physical, and emotional, um, all go through the roof. And we could talk more about what gets amplified and how much, but it's startling. It's significant above baseline. To put this differently, the way I like to say this, all human beings are hardwired for peak performance. Peak performance, by the way, is nothing fancier than just getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. This is not a new idea. The thinking, if you go back to the foundations of modern peak performance, when we were using psychology and neurobiology and physiology to study this stuff in the 1870s and 80s, you have people saying, hey, like you got to figure out, we got to get our biology working for us rather than against us. That's the secret. William James says the great thing in any education is to make our nervous system our ally and not our enemy. In fact, I think he said that in the Glasgow lectures. I could be wrong. It might be in his first book on textbook on psychology, but I think it might be the Glasgow lectures,
Wow.
where he says that. um, and So it's not a new idea. And it turns out that that's the same idea we have. It's 100 years later, and we've gone in a lot of different directions. We've tried a lot of different things. We've learned a ton. We've done a lot of things wrong, but we've come back to this core idea. And at the center of our biology, there's a bunch of other things that go on, but at the center is this state of consciousness known as flow. We are all built in to perform at our best. They're all in the evolution of our history, essentially like those hunters who could run a little farther with a little more painkiller and a little more target accuracy with their spears, got more meat, had more children, lived longer. That's an evolutionary advantage. Flow is that evolutionary advantage. That's sort of the origin story of flow. We think it evolved out of runner's high. Humans are the only species that adapted to run down their prey. We will literally run our prey into exhaustion. That's what we can do that other species cannot do. And that's those of us who could get into flow along the way, meaning you could flow to some of the things that flow does physically is it lowers pain or lowers our pain threshold, or higher increases our pain threshold, lowers our ability to perceive pain, um, turns up stamina and amplifies strength. That's on the physical side. And fast twitch muscle response. Those all get cranked up. And think about like early days in the African veldt, you're trying to run down an antelope, but you can run a little farther, last a little longer. You're going to get more food. That's an evolutionary advantage. So um, that is where we think flow first came from. And there's it stayed in our gene pool for a lot of reasons. It helped us collaborate with other animals, with dogs, with horses. There's cross species flow. Um, and it's a big long story. My book, A Small Furry Prayer, talks about this. But the point I want to make is we're all hardwired for flow. So everybody listening to me can get into flow. As I said, it's a startling increase over baseline. Let me just throw some numbers at you. And these are from all over the place. So McKinsey business consultancy, the global business consultancy, they wanted to know how much more productive are business leaders. So CEOs, COOs, CMOs, that level of companies in flow than outflow. They take 10 years. They find on average it's 500% more productive. That's enormous. That's a step function's worth of change. And normally when you hear a number like that in science, you got to laugh. Like that can't be real. And then we looked at the U.S. Defense Department and a woman named Chris Burka and a company named Advanced Brain Monitoring that makes great EEG headsets looked at soldiers in flow, how much faster they learn than out of flow. And it was 240 to 500% above normal. Then some researchers at the University of Sydney looked at how much more creative are people in flow than out of flow, and it was 700% above baseline. We redid similar creativity studies, trying to break creativity into its 8 subcategories, and we found that we found 400% above baseline was what we were finding. You see the same thing with a bunch of different categories, and then you get into the emotional stuff, which is where it's startling. Flow underpins overall life satisfaction, happiness, meaning, purpose. Psychologists now have three definitions of happiness. There's how you feel right here, right now, which is sort of like happiness. Then there's the next level up, which is the second best we get to feel on the planet, is enjoyment. It's a high flow lifestyle where the things that are driving you into flow are your goals. The best we get to feel is purpose. It's a high flow lifestyle. The thing that's getting you into flow is aligned with your purpose or cause greater than yourself. So really important for that. And then last thing I'll say, this is new research and we've suspected this for years, but it was great to have data. So we've known about the impact of flow on happiness, well-being, overall life, whatever, since the 60s. And all that's happened since then is we've gotten it's expanded. We've gotten more things around what flow is good for, but nobody's ever been able to prove the opposite. Hey, if flow is so goddamn good for happiness, it's got to be protective against depression, right? Like, and things like that. Those are hard studies to do, and they're tricky. And how do you do it with flow and whatever? And this brilliant team of folks in Europe figured it out, and they just published this in Nature Translational Psychiatry, so the biggest psychiatry journal in the world. And they found that flow is neuroprotective. So getting into flow regularly protects your brain against depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, cardiac related stress conditions, and schizophrenia. We proved, our lab, that flow can overwrite and it prevents PTSD. And then another lab in Europe, Karina Pfeiffer, her lab found that flow blocks burnout and prevents burnout. So I've just listed the 7 largest, leaving out ADHD, and there's great research on flow and ADHD, but nothing is definitive yet, so I won't talk about it. But I think we're going to add that to the things soon. But I've just listed every major mental health condition. Depression alone costs businesses about $1 trillion a year. PTSD, the number is about that high. And flow is literally the only, like, we don't have a pill that solves all those things. We don't have a protocol. Flow is the only thing, and it comes built in all of us. That's what's super cool here. So I'll stop there. That's flow.
I believe I either read or heard you talk about how flow contributes to the economy as well, because when we interact with hospitality or the arts, we're seeing and watching people in
Over
flow.
and over. So yeah, this is not my idea. It was the first person I heard say it was Salim Ismail, who was the former head of innovation at Yahoo, and then he was the first president of Singularity University in Silicon Valley. And we were talking, and he's worked a lot on how to help businesses work in accelerated technological environments, and he's so come to the same conclusion as I have, which is, for example, if you want the most leverage in business today, it's humans and flow plus AI. That's the right. And Salim, and we can talk more about that in a second, but Salim figured that out early on. And we were talking about it. He said, he said, if you think about it, a sizable chunk of our GDP is actually spent on watching or experiencing people in flow. You go to a restaurant, you want the chef in flow. You want your wait staff in flow. You go to a basketball game, you want to see the right. You want to see the star player in flow. You want to, and we know in basketball, there's been research on this. That basketball is a game of like dropping into flow and then knocking the opponent out of flow and vice versa. I've written articles about that. um, So you watch players in flow, rugby, players in flow, soccer, players in flow. Like, these are huge sporting events, but you go to the theater, actors in flow, you go to the movies, right? You go to see a band, musicians in flow. And when you start thinking about it, we literally spend it. You go to a freaking poetry reading, you want to see a poet in flow, slam poetry, you want to, right? We spend a significant portion of our lives either trying to be in flow ourselves or trying to be around other people who are in flow. It's a sizable chunk of the economy. And now, um because flow has moved from, when I started this stuff, psychologists knew what flow was. I would call a neuroscientist and I would have to talk for 20 minutes about flow before they had a fucking clue what I'm talking about. And now, we were just talking about this a couple of days ago in a meeting. It's at the level where pretty much every HR professional in business now knows about flow, knows about my work, knows about Csikszentmihalyi's work, knows about, you know what I mean? Like, it's gone from like tiny psychologists all the way to like really mainstream companies. When I look at like the companies Well, Christ, forget even the companies we train. We train people in 157 countries at this point. It's the crazy when I go into exit interviews, like when we're done training somebody, we usually do an exit interview. It is the number of different accents and people talking about flow in different accents from all over the world. It's really like it's shocking and sort of wonderful at this point. It's a neat spread. So it's really gone from this like rare and elite experience to something that's very reliable and repeatable and available to most people in the mainstream if you know how to train it.
Is flow ethically neutral, or is there a dark side of flow?
So it's interesting. Yes, there's a dark side of flow. Yes, flow is ethically neutral, but I will make the argument, though I could be proven wrong, that over time it is probably an ethical good. But let me back that up. So we know soldiers in flow are right. There's, I mean, and we've got, in fact, if you go into the flow literature in the 50s and 60s, a lot of it is military literature. And if you go all the way back to the Shaolin Temple or you go all the way back to the samurai warrior traditions, those are essentially a lot of that stuff is our flow manuals, right? Like as well, this is optimal performance, um, um, combat in flow. Really, you know what I mean? That's how you live, in a sense. And we did a lot of work in my book. Stealing Fire opens with stories about the Navy SEALs, and that's essentially all. What the Navy SEALs do is they train teams to operate in group flow. That's the secret of what the SEALs do. In fact, their entire Hell Week, everything else you think of as SEAL training, is actually a giant filter system for individuals who are great at group flow. That's what they've built. And that's what Stealing Fire opens with and talks about and things like that. Yes, they're looking for physical skills and a handful of other things, but they're really looking for like the core group flow skills. They need people who can drop into group flow because there's no other way to thrive in combat situations. So I don't know how I got here. What did you ask me that got me onto the military?
The dark side of flow.
Oh, the dark side. Okay. So cat burglars in flow, right? I mean, like pickpockets in flow, like of course. That said, and that's part of it. There's another dark side of flow. Even if you're getting into flow, doing great things, wonderful things for the world, it's a big high. It's followed by a deep low, right? You use a lot of energy, you use a lot of neurochemistry in the state. What goes up must come down. And if you don't know that's coming, you don't know how to manage that high. That's why you see a lot of, for example, in action sports, a lot of drug addiction on like the pro surf tour. People will huge flow highs from competing and they come to shore and flow. Peak concentration lasts 90 minutes. It can last longer and you can drop in and out, but like on average, it's a 90-minute high. And if you've had this big high from this huge win, and people will chase it and they'll chase it with drugs, or they'll do what most of us do. We have big highs at work, big flow highs at work. We succeed on a project, and what do? We go out with our mates and get drunk and party. Yay! And what happens is you've now broken your sleep cycle. You've done stuff, and you're going to end up locked out of flow on top of everything else you did. So you're going to make it a little worse, unless you understand how the state works and can kind of avoid that behavior. So we talk about those things, the dark side of flow. But let me talk about the moral good. I said flow amplifies a lot of skills, emotionally. I don't know if you would call these cognitive skills or emotional skills, maybe on the line, but we know that flow over time makes you more empathetic. So it increases empathy over time and it increases perspective taking, our ability to see things from other people's perspectives. And if I care about this a great deal, it amplifies what's known as environmental awareness, which is our ability to see, perceive, and care about the natural world more over time. So there is a movement. It's slow, right? It's a slow, steady increase, and there are things that can block this stuff. There's a lot of psychology is packed with like they call them moderators. They're if then conditions. Like you can have these superpowers, but you have to do this work first, kind of thing. Um, so I think there's probably some adult development stuff here that could block this if you have trouble forgiving others, forgiving yourself, right? Like that will end up blocking these empathetic developments. But as a general rule, flow over time will do that. It's slow because I mean Laird Hamilton used to say this. Say this like if flow is making me into a good person, then every surfer would be a Buddha, and that's really not the case, right? Like that's really not the case. So or every skater, right? Like, and you just know that's not true. Or boxing is a super flowy sport, you know.
Do you have any recommendations or activities one can do to regulate the ups and downs of flow state? I think I relate to your sentiment quite a lot. I do stand up comedy in my spare time, and the highs are so high, but
Mm,
gosh, the lows are so fucking low.
they're pretty bad. Yeah. So okay, let's the simplest thing. And when we work with clients who come in burnt out, this is exactly where we have to start with them. So, flow is a high energy state. Well, I mean, actually back up one step. Flow is not a binary. You're not in the zone or out of the zone. It's actually a four-stage cycle. On the front end of a flow state, there's a struggle phase. This is a loading phase. You're sort of learning things still. Your flow happens when the brain can perform in emotion, right? Without having to think about it. Effortless effort. It's automatized, to use the language. So when we're learning a skill, say to swing a bat at a ball, right? We break it into a bunch of subcategories. Keep your eye on the ball, step into the pitch, swing all the way through. There's 7 or 8 different components of hitting a ball with a bat. And we learn, sometimes you can chunk them, learn 2 or 3 at once. But some people, if you're super klutzy like me, you're going to learn them one at a time, right? And then there's a moment when your brain goes, oh, I can put all this stuff together at the same time. And you like, boom, that's usually when flow starts to appear. And it's automatized, but you have to still learn all those skills. So struggle on the front end when you're learning the skills and you're doing it consciously. Then there's a release phase. You take your mind off the problem. To get through that, usually low grade physical activity works really well. Shower, long walk in nature, gardening, jigsaw puzzles, building model airplanes, drawing, anything that sort of like engages you but doesn't exhaust you. Um, is really good for the release phase. Third is the flow state itself. And then on the back end of the flow state, big high, uses lots of energy. There's a recovery period. And in the recovery period, as I said, there's no more feel good neurochemistry. And you have to be able to move through all of these and reboot the flow cycle to really maximize performance. So, what does that mean? One of the main things it means is 7 to 8 hours of sleep at night, as much as you possibly can. That's what all humans need. There's no you can argue with me, you can do whatever you want, and I always tell people like because when I work in Silicon Valley, the entrepreneurs love to be like they get this warrior thing where they're like I sleep 3 hours a night, I sleep 2.5 hours a night, I do 2 hours. You just like okay, buddy.
It's a
And here's
badge
what I
of
always
honor
say
for
to
them,
people: I'm
isn't it?
like, look, it's a badge of honor, but here's what we do. Here's what we do with our clients when they do this, and we do this with entrepreneurs. There are IQ tests all over the net, and the one I like is the Wonderlic because they give it to football players in America, and most executives, CEOs think they're definitely smarter than the average football player, right? And so I like to use the Wonderlic, which is a lot harder than most people actually realize. But I have people take it one day after they've slept 7 to 8 hours, and I'm like, great, let's forget the questions. Let a couple weeks go by. They scramble the questions anyways. Pick a night where you've slept 5 hours or 6 hours and you think you're sharp, you think you got it, and let's retake the test. Most people are like 10 to 15 IQ points dumber. Like it's a big drop. You go from like genius to average, right? Like it can be significant for most people. So 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, if you can get it. Obviously, you don't need it every night, but if as close as we can, that really matters. The other thing that really matters is active recovery, not passive recovery. So most people, if they're not going to go out party after a big win or comedy, right? They're going to go for passive recovery. What's passive recovery? It's TV and a beer. And the problem is, depending on your weight, but for most of us, alcohol wise, once you're like 1.5 drinks in, you fucked up your REM sleep. So now you've just killed your ability to get 8 hours of sleep at night. Um, so you're not that, like that will block flow. Television is this weird thing. Movies do it. YouTube can do it. A lot of that stuff will do it. We don't realize it. We're like couch potatoes zoned out. But every time the brain registers motion, fast motion, like a quick cut on television, motion to a human brain means, oh, something is alive there. And as soon as we see something that's alive, the brain runs a program. Is that a predator? Is it a threat? Or is it an opportunity, right? Is that a friend, or is it an opportunity for sex or food, or, and it jumps our brain waves from like relax, chill, alpha waves all the way up to high beta, which is awake, alert, and stressed. And we don't feel it. You don't notice it. It happens subconsciously, but it's why you ever watch TV for like 3 or 4 hours and you're fucking exhausted afterwards, right? And you don't know why. You're like, I've just been chilling out and I should be, right. Instead, I'm exhausted. Why am I exhausted? That's why. It's because the quick cuts have stolen. You feel like you've been chilling, and your actual brain is in fight or flight, thinking it's running away from a predator on the veldt, and we don't notice. So passive sucks. Active recovery, long walk in nature, breath work is phenomenal. Meditation, restorative yoga, um, exercise, a daily gratitude practice, Epsom salt baths, saunas, reading fiction, reading a novel for 6 minutes is the equivalent to like 10 minutes of breath work and meditation. It lowers stress levels that much. So what I always tell people is you got a choice. You got a freaking menu. How much time do you have? You got 5 minutes? Cool. Do a gratitude practice. If you've got 6 minutes, read a novel. If you've got 7 to 11 minutes, breath work is your bet. If you've got like 15 to 20, go for a walk in nature. If you've got 20 to 60, go to the gym, get a workout. You know what I mean? Like, depending on, like, those are all really good recovery practices. You obviously have to eat well and drink plenty of water, right? But we don't do them. And we also forget that the modern world bombards us with things that makes us anxious. It's very hard not to be in super anxiety all the time for a million different reasons that have to do with distraction and a number of things vying for our attention in the modern world. Um, you can take huge steps to protect yourself. I do that. I'm a hermit a lot of the time, and a lot of things are very blocked out. Um, I usually hear the news, but it's usually like a week to two after it happens, kind of thing. But most of us live at very high stress levels. It's problematic for flow as well. So not only does it crush performance, but it also blocks flow. Too much stress, too much norepinephrine and cortisol, which are the neurochemicals and the hormones underneath stress, will block flow. And for a bunch of different reasons, but so you got to recover, right, properly, and you also want to reset your nervous system along the way because you're about to enter into struggle, right? You've gone through recovery, but what's waiting for you is struggle, and struggle's hard. So if you don't fully recover and get your nervous system back to zero, you're about to enter into struggle, and what's going to happen? You're redlined, and now you're locked out of flow again, and that is also dark side of flow. And then I'll shut up. But like when you are used to the greatest high on earth, and literally like this is our favorite feeling on earth, group flow more than individual flow, what like a team performing at their best will like more than individual flow, but we take this over any other pleasure, right? We prefer it over, and that includes sex and drugs and, you know, travel and things we love to do. We will prefer flow and group flow. And if you have it, it's reliable and repeatable, and suddenly it's not. I work with a lot of people who are transitioning out of the military or transitioning out of sports and spec ops or action sports. And it's a challenging transition because they've had easy access to these very big highs for a very long time. And what do you do?
In a
One
similar,
thing you do is stand up comedy, by the way. It's a great substitute because it's all the same fear. Social fear is the same as physical fear. It's processed in the same structure in the brain. So there's no difference. If you've got a fear of public speaking, and stand-up comedy is always ruthless, right? It's never kind. That environment is, or it's rarely kind. And the competition is fierce. So like, it's a great transition thing for people to take up as they're coming out of sports. In fact, I was just with a ex-Marine this past weekend, last week, who I just got a text from her this morning that said I've signed up for improv comedy classes.
Oh.
It's like, yes.
I see so many parallels between action sports or skateboarding, in my case, and stand up comedy. You're in it alone, but you're in it together. And that sense of shared suffering really creates a really intimate connection with other comics, but also with the audience. And I can imagine the audience are entering flow state because it's one of the only environments where I see a group of people cohesively do the same thing. Uh, uh,
You
um,
see it. You see it with music sometimes, like especially punk when there was a thrash pit and it was more interactive, right? You
mm,
get the same kind of thing. You can get it, but you are right. Well, so reading's the most common flow state on earth, just to put this in perspective. So as a writer, I write in very specific ways to try to drive my readers into flow. One of the reasons people say, "Oh, wow, your books are really easy to read and they're fun to read." It's not just that. It's that when you're in flow, pattern recognition, your ability to connect ideas together is massively amplified. So I am intentionally driving you into flow so I can make you smarter and teach you harder things and you're going to get them. So there's a way to do that, and good writers will do it instinctively. Good comics will do it instinctively. You know what I mean? There's different ways in, but I totally agree with you, and I think it's there, in all the art forms. But comedy, it, I was just listening to Trevor Noah, who I don't know, but he was talking to um, why did I just blank his name? Started the Dave Chappelle show with Dave. He's actually an acquaintance of mine. Anyways, they were having a conversation about how so many professional comics use comedy and flow to treat themselves for ADHD.
mm.
And that's also, you see that in action sports a lot. You see very, very ADHD people who can't focus until you turn up the consequences. And you turn up the consequences, and suddenly everybody can focus perfectly. So you see the same thing a lot with comics. It's a high wire act. Action sport athletes, it's a high wire act. You also see it with scientists, also because you don't know this from the outside, but science is you think professional sports is competitive. Go to a neuroscience conference. Go literally, like you haven't seen blood. I've been at
Wow.
neuroscience conference where somebody will stand up and make a comment, just like they've talked for 30 seconds, and I've seen somebody else who like won a Nobel Prize stand up and yell at them for 45 minutes straight. Like that's not uncommon at neuroscience conferences. It's a blood sport for sure.
You speak about these comedians and skateboarders or extreme sport athletes ramping up the consequences to enter flow to treat themselves for ADHD. Is that in line with is it the challenge skill balance that you talk about in your book? Are they
Two
actively
things.
embodying that state?
Let's pull it back one step further and go big picture for a second. Flow states have triggers. You want more flow in your life? These triggers are your toolkit. We've discovered, the field of flow researchers have discovered, I think 27 or 28 at this point. There are about 12 to 15 on the individual side, and then there's another equal number on the group flow side. I think we have a few more group flow triggers than individual triggers at this point. Um, what do they all have in common is the main point. And flow follows focus. It only shows up when all our attention is right here, right now. So that's what all the triggers do. They do it a bunch of different ways neurobiologically, but really they just drive our attention to the present moment. So risk, flow trigger, of course, right? When things are scary, we just pay more attention to what's going on. You're talking about challenge skills balance, which is similar but different. And this is challenge skills balance is known as the golden rule of flow, the most important trigger. The idea is, once again, flow follows focus. So we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch, but not snap. Mathematically, it's usually about a 4 or 5% difference. When the challenge is 4 or 5% greater than our skills, that's the sweet spot. What does that mean in emotional terms? Big picture, this flow channel that I'm talking about, the challenge skill sweet spot. Big picture is it's in between boredom. There's not enough stimulation here. I don't care. I'm not paying any attention. And anxiety, way too much. I can't stop paying attention, right? In between is this like 4% sweet spot. And what's interesting is If you're shy, meek, timid, or like less skilled at whatever it is that you're doing, right? 4% is going to be tricky because you're going to be outside your comfort zone. Not super far. You're not gripped. You're not frozen, but you're outside your comfort zone. You're uneasy. You're uncomfortable. You know you're going to have to sort of like get gritty to take that first step. If you are really skilled in the area, if you are a hard charging type A type entrepreneurs have this problem, a lot of pro athletes have this problem, you will naturally gravitate towards these enormous challenges. I do it myself. Really big, crazy. I'm going to win a gold medal. I'm going to do this impossible thing, that sort of stuff. And it's not that those are bad from a human motivation standpoint. Those are actually very motivating and they're great. But what you have to do is you've got to chunk it down. So the thing that you're doing right here, right now, today is about 4 or 5% greater. And sometimes that means like a time limit, right? I'm going to give this activity just an hour. Or sometimes that like, and it's a moving target. I'll give you an example that I always like talking about because it helps people wrap their head around it. When I write a book, right? I'm always writing a book and I try to write every day. And when I'm starting a book, I usually only write about 5 to 600 words in the book because you can get about 350 words into, and that's like one idea. And then you got to do a transition. Let me get you from idea A to idea B. And for any writer, that's hard. That's where things go wrong. That's where things get complicated. So like 350 is easy, but to get you to 500, I got to do the hard work of getting to the next idea. And there's usually going to be a moment of like grunting or there's going to be some pain, right? In the middle of a book, I know a little bit more what I'm doing. So I'm writing 7 to 800 words a day. At the end of a book, it's like 1,100 or 1,500. And it's sort of the same thing when I'm building a speech, right? In the beginning, like the first day, maybe I'll get like a handful of slides in there and just sort of like, this is the frame and the outline. They come back the next day. It's a little flowier. I know more and I'm getting, bigger. And by the third day, I can just lump in the rest because boom, that's where it goes. And that's a really flowy presentation that I get to build. So does that make some sense on the talent skills balance? You can
Yeah.
see how you can apply it.
One of the things I want to call out is the state of anxiety. How do flow and anxiety interact?
So that is exactly why too much anxiety blocks flow. You've got this challenge skills sweet spot. Boredom's on one end, anxiety's on the other. And it's really norepinephrine, this one neurochemical that is governing all of this. Cortisol's involved a little bit. There's others, maybe vasopressin and testosterone, but it's really about norepinephrine. And so everybody knows I'm using this big fancy word, but we all know this feeling. We know what norepinephrine feels like when you're feeling like excited and like folk. I'll give you a great example. So when you meet somebody you're attracted to and you can't stop thinking about them, your brain is just spiraling, it's going back to them and back to them and back to them. That's norepinephrine. That's curiosity bordering towards anxiety, right on that line. If I crank that up a little bit, right? If you love her, you can't stop thinking about her, and then your friend calls and has been like, yeah, she went out with this other dude the other night. Now you're spiraling into the bad thoughts and you can't stop. That's anxiety. Just move it. But it's the same neurochemical. So here's a crazy thing that they discovered at Harvard. It is easier if you're feeling anxiety to turn it into excitement than it is to get rid of it. So literally, the next time you're feeling anxious, this is so goofy, but try it. You can literally stand up and say, I am excited, I am excited, I am excited. And if while thinking about the thing that you're anxious about, and your brain will switch, you have reframed it into anxiety. They were trying to test that against breath work, and they found 7 minutes of breath work or I'm excited. I'm excited. I'm excited. Yeah, it was crazy. There was a really wild finding too. Same study. So, you want to talk about like entrenched misogyny and sexism? Here's an amazing example. So they found when they were doing that study, part of the study group were women over 40, and they actually couldn't tell the difference between anxiety and excitement. They didn't know they were two different emotions because women over 40, this was like 20 years ago, it was a group of women who were not allowed to feel their emotions because an emotional woman is not a good thing. And hysteria and mania. These were mental illnesses in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Get you sent to bed for like 2 years. So like, try to be calm, try to be calm. And so women really weren't allowed to feel excitement. It was bad, and it came with consequences. So for a certain generation of women, they literally had no idea there was this other feeling known as excitement. They just all thought it was anxiety. It was the most amazing, like, wayward finding in the study, but it's a fairly powerful tool. I'll use it. Sometimes I use it before I go on stage, right? If it's a big enough speech and there's 10,000 people in the room, and I'm like, okay, all right, that's a lot of people, you know. Or I'll do it on top of a ski mountain, you know what I mean? Or if I go to show up at the beach and I'm like, oh, the waves are big, and literally every time I go surfing or skateboarding, because it's always on a prayer.
That's awesome. I'm hijacking that. I'm using that before every comedy gig for sure. In a similar way,
It's really it's really good. The other one you can do is you can look out the corners of your eyes, peripheral vision, because fight or flight, we're tightly focused on the thing in front of us. But when you look out the corner of your eyes, that wide vista, the brain goes, "Oh, he's looking out of the corner of his eyes. Everything must be safe, because otherwise you would never do that." So the biggest secret, if you want to do like three things at once, like I am excited, I am excited, I'm excited, looking out the corner of your eyes, and then just like slow your inhales to double, or slow your exhales to double your inhale. Because if you do that like 7 times, it's not a total flush, but what the brain goes is, wow, your exhales are really slow. You must be totally safe. And it's the same mechanism like looking out of the corner of your eye. Your brain just goes, well, you're doing these things that you do when you're safe, so maybe you are safe. It's like a little bit fake it towards you make it. So you can combine those two with the I am excited, and it's pretty like you end up with like an alert sort of focused thing, um, which is great. And what's great about it is, it's a sort of final thought. I know we're running out of time, and I gotta jump into something else. But what's really good about this is being able to stay inside that challenge skills sweet spot, which is the really one of the greatest secrets to maximizing the amount of flow in your life, is always knowing how to just like steer yourself there and sort of stay there. Um, Requires, you got to be able to identify fear in your system, right? You got to sort of like, so super tough guys who never want to feel fear are really bad at this. Like, they don't have the interoceptive skills you need to do this. You see it with a lot of athletes. They don't get good at flow until like they have their first major accident, and suddenly they're mortal and they realize they can break, and you can't just do it on courage alone. You know what I mean? You have to have other skills, and coming back is harder, because coming back from any injury, you're negotiating with fear, right? You have an unconscious governor. If I get in a ski accident at 40 miles an hour, my body might be healed in 3 to 6 months, but my brain won't let me ski at speed again for about a year and a half, because I've got an unconscious governor. And so it's a negotiation with fear at an unconscious level. And if you can't ID fear in your system, you can't do this. So like, you need some level of self awareness. I like teaching people about norepinephrine, because like, oh, it's that thing that feels twitchy, right? I feel twitchy on the inside. Oh, that's norepinephrine. Okay, cool. Twitchy is either like anxiety or it's curiosity and excitement. Oh, okay, right. I can turn one to the other. Whereas, other things feel different ways, and it's useful to be able to identify them, to tune the challenge skills sweet spot, and sort of maximize flow.
Stephen, to leave on a practical note for our listener who might be not in a domain or career that sparks that risk reward ratio or is designed for challenge and skill, how can they hijack their neurobiology to enter flow if they're in a mundane 9 to 5 office kind of job?
So, really great question. And I have a bunch of different answers. So, couple things you have to start with. So flow follows focus. Autonomy is a flow trigger, the ability to drive your own bus. So when you have organizations, for example, Google, 20% time, right, where they allow engineers to spend 20% of their work life working on projects of their own devising. Why? Because autonomy is a flow trigger. Patagonia is another company that's really good at flow. They let employees make their own schedules. So what do you do if you've got a shit employer who doesn't allow you to do any of that and you don't have autonomy? How do you do it then? Well, there's a couple different ways. One of the first things that what I really tell people is reframing. In the same way we just used reframing to go, I am excited, I'm excited. So what you have to stop and go is, okay, I've got this shitty 9 to 5 job. It's paying the bills, but my purpose, my passion is X, Y, or Z. That's where I'm going to be moving over the course of my life. And you know that. And maybe I've got this really shitty, mundane job, but there's this one part of my job that requires sales. And I'm going to need sales to pursue my passion and my purpose. So, yeah, I got to do a bunch of stuff, but this is really about me getting better at sales so I can pursue my purpose. So you've now reframed the shit thing that you have to do this way. I'll give you another example from my own life. This exact situation. It wasn't really a mundane boss, but when I was coming up as a journalist, I was poor. I had to say yes to every assignment that came my way. And some of them were really boring. Some of them were really boring assignments for like fairly boring magazines or things like that. So I would make a crazy writing challenge. Oh, you want me to write about data caves and their benefits for lawyers? Okay. Can I do it in the style of Charles Dickens? And like, right? Like, cause that's weird. And I'm not even a huge Dickens fan, but like, it's hard to write like Dickens. And it's going to be even harder to slip Dickens past an editor at like, the magazine that wants this article on data caves. And that's interesting. So what I've done is I've sort of reframed the problem to give myself a little more autonomy and play and curiosity. And I've turned up the challenge skills balance a little bit. So this formerly boring thing, right? Toyota did this very well with their management philosophy, Kaizen. So you got to
Mm.
like think about Toyota. Like, what is duller than working on the assembly line, right? There is no duller job you can have than I'm a cog. I work on an assembly line, and Toyota said, okay. But when they introduced Kaizen is a management philosophy of continuous improvement. It's built on 2 flow triggers: autonomy and the challenge skills balance. If you work at Toyota, your job may be put tire hubcap on tire, right? Like that's my job. I do the hubcap on tire, but that's not actually your job. No, no, no. In Kaizen, your job is to put hubcaps on tires, but it's actually to improve the entire hubcap on tire system, the entire process, and all your team members. And you're so good at hubcaps on tires, can you find a way to shave off an extra quarter second? And suddenly, employees that didn't have autonomy and weren't in the challenge skills sweet spot were. And if you look at so Toyota introduces Kaizen in the 50s. It doesn't really get going until the early 1980s. And if you know anything about, like, if you're as old as I am, Toyota comes into the 1980s and nobody wants a Toyota. Like literally, that's like, if you're like, yeah, I got to buy a Toyota, what you're saying is I've got no money and I just got to go get a beater. That's right. I'm poor. I'm broke. I'm going to get a shit car. And God help me. And by the end of the 90s, within 20 years, Toyota was the number one automotive worker in the world. They were one of the best. They became one of the best companies in the world, and tons of management philosophies. Six Sigma is the most famous. Got built out of these ideas, right? And it's really 2 flow triggers that did it. And that's what they did. This is, by the way, the other thing. When people see this big list of flow triggers, they get sort of intimidated. But if you look at the organizations who have been best at this, they've really focused on 1 or 2 triggers that are really aligned with like who they are. What are their values? What are their strengths? What's their purpose? What's their mission statement? What are the triggers that fit this culture? And I think the same thing is true for individuals. The individuals I've seen who really are great at this find one. I mean, you'll end up using more of them, but they'll really focus as they're learning this stuff on 1 or 2 triggers. Oh, I'm going to use the challenge skills balance and I'm going to use risk. And it could be physical risk, but usually that it's like in a corporate environment, it's intellectual risk or social risk, right? I'm going to speak up at the meeting instead of being silent. Or intellectual risk, I'm going to present my colleagues my neat idea rather than just keeping it to myself, right? Like those are risk opportunities that exist even inside mundane job environments. The only time I tell people to get out of a job is if you have a passive aggressive boss, or you're working in a company that is sort of built to maximize distraction. And if they're unwilling to change. And the reason is both of those things are guaranteed drivers of burnout. And burnout's a guaranteed, it's a mental health condition. And once you get burned out, you're sort of fucked. And if you're sort of, I told you, I came out of like a blue collar communities, and if you're working those kinds of jobs where you can't really skip a paycheck kind of thing, if you end up burned out, you're going to end up losing your job. And let's say, even if you get another one right away, you're now burned out. You've got an actual mental health condition that you have to fix before you're going to be any good at the next thing. So that's a problem that has to be avoided like the plague. And we know leaders in flow tend to drive their teams into flow. So when people are like, oh, I want to, I'm a manager, what do I do at my company? Figure out how to get into flow yourself, because you'll drive your team into flow. It's contagious. Literally, in the same way that emotions are contagious, flow is contagious. So, but if you have a passive aggressive boss, somebody who keeps moving the goalposts on you, or you have a company that like demands you have 15 different information chains on and turned on and responding to them at all times, you're gonna lose in that environment, and you're going to end up blocking flow completely. Interestingly, so the Godfather of Flow Psychology, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, did this back in the 60s. He blocked flow, microflow. So this is like reading at work, or when two middle managers get into a conversation, an hour goes by and they didn't even notice. You sit down to write a quick email to a colleague and you get so sucked in, you write an essay. They blocked microflow at work for 2 days. And you read like the like what happened to people, and it's like the worst case of burnout ever. People are like, I'm paranoid, I hate people, I want to punch people in the face, I can't focus, I can't do anything. It's like really crazy. And this is after 2 days of microflow blocking. And you think about like modern and most modern company cultures, because they're so packed with distractions, they don't allow people to focus. They block microflow. And I look at this stuff and I'm like, wait a minute, you're guaranteeing me that you're going to burn me out. Like I'm guaranteed that, and I'm going to get burned out, and I'm going to either quit or get fired, right? The people who stay at jobs, I have high flow jobs. Those are engaged employees. The ones who are quietly quitting, those are people who you block flow. We can't enjoy our lives without flow. We don't work well without microflow, and trying to fake it doesn't really work over time. It just destroys us as individuals.
Stephen, this has been a hell of a podcast. The last hour it's felt like 5 minutes. I've been in flow. Thank you so much for coming on
See?
the show.
And my work here is done. It was all you. You were the one driving the conversation.
Thanks, Stephen.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening, guys. I don't know. Parting words. What do you need? Should we be done?